Hello and welcome to this webinar hosted by the CIEEM Academic Special Interest Group. I'm Des Delahaye. I'm a wildlife biologist. I work with the Animal and Plant Health Agency and I'm an ecological consultant at RSK Biocensus. I'm also convener of the ASIG, where our aims are to encourage links between academia and consultant ecologists to promote educational opportunities for ecologists and environmental managers, and foster research to provide the evidence base that we all need to underpin practice in ecological consultancy. If these subjects excite you, then please get in touch because we're always looking for new members. So today we are very privileged to have with us a speaker who knows everything there is to know about water vole surveying. Catherine Lillistone is our speaker today. She's from the Environment Agency, where her role is biodiversity and technical specialist. She's based in Yorkshire, and she's been with the EA for 22 years. But in 2022, she completed a master's in land and ecological restoration, which involved research on water vole survey methods. She's the EA's lead, therefore, on water voles in Yorkshire and manages the Yorkshire Water Vole Project, which aims to protect local water vole populations through conducting surveys, mink eradication, and habitat restoration. And her talk today is on best practice guidance for water voles. And it couldn't be more timely, given that Natural England have just announced a strategic licensing pilot for water voles in part of the country. Just to let you know, there'll be an opportunity for some questions after Catherine finishes her talk. So if you want to stick a question in the chat, we'll try to cover as many of those as possible when she's finished speaking. So without further ado, over to you, Catherine. Would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Okay, hopefully that's working and everyone can see that.
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, hello everyone, and thanks for coming along this evening. Thanks for that intro. I'm not sure I know everything about water vole survey. I think that might be overplaying it somewhat, but yeah, I've had a bit of experience certainly in the field now. So this is basically based on my research dissertation for my master's, which was comparing the results obtained from the sort of traditional best practice field science surveys for water voles compared to some of the alternative methods that are now available that have sort of appeared over the last few recent years. And from that, for this presentation, sort of formulated that question: should the good practice guidance for water vole surveys be updated, or should we stick with that current guidance and keep it as it is? So just to sort of give you a bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about this evening, I'll give you a bit of an introduction to water voles, a few factors affecting the water voles, their current sort of distribution and status across the country. I'll talk to you about the 5 different water vole survey methods that I compared, and there's those different sites that I looked at those survey methods across Yorkshire. I'll talk about my results that I obtained, and then the analysis that I did on those results, and give you a bit of an overview of some of the conclusions that I came to. And then I've got a few sort of questions at the end that might sort of raise some discussion that have come out of that, and sort of further potential areas of research that could be looked at. So for those, I might be talking to the converted here, but for people that don't know, the water vole is Britain's largest vole species. They're quite chunky little beasts. They're up to about 20 centimetres long, weighing sort of 300 up to 350 grams sometimes, some of the bigger ones, generally sort of 150 grams upwards. And they have this dark tail-covered hair that's kind of a tail covered in hair, and that's about 2/3 the length of their body. That's like a totally different thing from the sort of brown rat that people often confuse them with, which has that completely hairless tail that's much longer. And they have this very very sweet little rounded face, a blunt muzzle, and these small neat ears that don't really stick up. So they just have a generally neat appearance, and they are just pretty cute, really. So typical water vole habitat, they're usually found in sort of slow flowing rivers and streams. Those kind of soft banks give them places in which they can burrow. So you'll find them along drainage ditches, also canals and still water bodies, ponds. And generally they favour areas where there's less tree cover, because what they need is lots of different food sources of kind of herbaceous and emergent vegetation to eat, that sort of marginal vegetation along watercourses. So these pictures here show kind of perfect ideal habitat. These were a couple of the sites that I surveyed in part of my research, and these kind of locations are ideal, that sort of slow water and good soft banks to burrow into. So they can be found in both upland and lowland areas. They're found in urban areas and also sort of countryside. So as long as that habitat's available and it's suitable, you can find them there. So you're less likely to find them in places where it's really rocky, if you've got very fast flowing water or really rapid changes in water levels. That's not going to really favour water voles in particular. So. And then over the years, there have been obviously various pressures affecting water voles. So like a lot of other species that we have, they've suffered with that sort of general loss and degradation of their habitat. So urbanisation has been a key thing, obviously spreading of development encroaching on watercourses within that riparian zone, obviously that completely removes their habitat, where especially where we've got hard engineering. So anywhere that the banks are reinforced with concrete or metal piling, obviously that immediately prevents water voles from being able to burrow into those bank sides and create their spaces and their living areas there. So that's had a huge impact. Since the Second World War, obviously changing agricultural practices, so a massive increase obviously in land drainage. There's been a reduction in the number of ditches have been filled in, ponds have been filled in, agricultural land, and so that again has resulted in that sort of direct loss of habitat. They're also subject to compaction of ground, which makes it more difficult for them to be able to burrow into the bank. So if you've got really heavy livestock grazing next to a watercourse, that can leads to a lot of ground poaching, that can have an effect on them. And the same thing running large machinery, agricultural machinery, again really close, and cropping right up to the tops of watercourse banks is not a good thing for the water voles, and obviously also removes their sort of a lot of their food source if there's a lot of poaching going on there. They can also be subject now, obviously, to impacts of climate change. So either from extreme flood events, obviously they will move to higher ground and they will move into adjacent habitat away from those flood waters. But that obviously can mean that their main burrows are flooded out. It can leave them more vulnerable to predation, and obviously the same thing with drought conditions, as is happening now. If you've got really low water levels, they've lost that means of escape from land-based predators if their sort of watercourse has got limited amount of water in it left and they can no longer dive into the water to escape from those predators. So those are the two sides of the sort of climate change coin. In places, impacts of abstraction can also reduce the suitability of a habitat for them if you've got particularly high abstraction rates for agricultural use again and other private uses. They can be prone if there's a serious pollution incident in a spot location. Obviously that can have a bad impact on water voles in that location, and there has also been some research into links potentially between some of the sort of chemical cleaning products in household cleaning products that we use, and those having an impact potentially on their breeding success rate. Obviously, like a lot of small mammals, they're an important prey for lots of predators, obviously lots of our native predators, both land and water-based, which that's fine, because they normally they breed rapidly like most small mammals, and they can cope with that, and that's all part of the sort of natural balance of the system. But since the non-Native American mink was brought across this country for the fur trading industry in the 1920s, unfortunately, there's either been escapes from those mink farms, or they were released when the mink farms were shut down. They've spread across the whole of the British Isles pretty much, and that's just had a huge impact on water vole populations. It's really, along with habitat loss, the key factor that's affected those populations. The difference being between our native predators, like an otter. Otters are too big to be able to follow water voles into their burrows, so they've got that means of escape if they can get into their burrows. But on the other hand, the female and juvenile mink are small enough to be able to get into water vole burrows. So where they can access water voles, they've just decimated those populations basically. So they've just got no sort of means of escape from that American mink predator. So in terms of their distribution, they used to be, as I say, widespread and common, widely distributed across the whole of the UK. But from that sort of baseline survey, we've had baseline surveys done. The main one was in the late 1980s, early 90s by Vincent Wildlife Trust. And so they did this national water vole survey at that point in time, and it looked at almost 3,000 sites across the country. And that was basically looking to see whether there were signs of water voles present at those locations that they picked. And unfortunately, that identified that there'd been a huge decline in water vole occupied sites, so over 98% compared to the baseline figures from 1939. So that's obviously catastrophic declines. There's not been enough money, unfortunately, to completely redo that national survey. But there has been the National Water Vole Database and Mapping Project that's run from 2008 onwards, and that's still going on now, and that relies a lot on volunteers submitting survey data, and also it tries to sort of collate data from all the sort of wildlife trusts around the country and anybody else doing surveys to try and sort of keep up to date with the current distribution. And they've just released their latest sort of update. And although they're doing better in certain areas, it's again, unfortunately, like identified a further decline from the sort of previous report, which is obviously not a good sign. And so as a consequence of that, water voles are fully protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981. So they're both water voles and their habitat, so their burrows and their places of where they rest they're both fully protected legally. So it's an offence if you disturb them in their habitat or obstruct their access to that habitat, or if you kill or injure a water vole as well. So obviously, in terms of myself working for the Environment Agency, we do a lot of flood defence works, and it's obviously a key part of our role is to make sure that we're compliant with legislation. And so whenever we're doing any kind of works in watercourse which could have an impact on water voles, that needs to be taken into account. And if they're present in that area, then those works are going to need to include mitigation and are highly likely to need to be carried out under a licence. And so obviously as a species that it's suffered these catastrophic declines, it's identified as a priority species under the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act. And so therefore that puts a sort of legal duty on public bodies and other organisations to try and conserve that species as far as they can throughout their works. And obviously to be able to do that, we need to know where they occur, and obviously that's where surveying comes in. We can't protect a species unless we know where it is. And so that comes back to the current best practice guidance for water vole surveys is to search for field signs. So you go out during the breeding season. Ideally, you do 2 surveys, and that's between April generally and September. One sort of April to June time, and then the second sort of July until September. Normally the peak populations are towards that September end, at the end of the breeding season, and they can have multiple broods throughout that breeding season. So that, and you would generally search the conservation, the waterfowl conservation handbook says that you should search for along 500-meter stretch of a watercourse in amongst the vegetation, and you're looking basically for these field signs that are left by the waterfoals. And so the classic one that can't be confused with anything else are their droppings, which are always referred to as their tic-tac shaped. So they're quite a reasonable length, 8 to 12 mil long, 4 to 5 mil wide. And they're just this very distinctive shape that can't be confused with anything else. So if you find waterfowl droppings, that's a definite presence, confirmed presence of waterfoals. So they like to deposit them in these latrines as shown here. So this is the females that are marking out their sort of territorial boundaries of their breeding areas. So they'll deposit droppings and then they'll stamp them down with their hind feet and brush scent from their sort of glands on the sides of their bodies onto the top of these latrines and deposit fresh droppings on top as a bit of a marker, basically to say, this is my patch, keep out. And they maintain those latrines throughout the breeding season. So that's another key thing that we're looking for, and we're looking for surveys during that breeding season. So other classic signs that you can look for, obviously you can look for their burrows in the banks. They can have burrows underneath the water, obviously, so they can get in from under the water, but also almost at the water's edge, and then further up the bank as well, they'll have exit points from different sort of parts of their burrows. So they tend to be sort of, it's referred to as like a squash tennis ball shape, so they're wider than they are high, and that's sort of 4 to 6 centimeters in diameter, obviously to give enough space for that chunky vole to get in. They're obviously feeding on the sort of emergent vegetation around their burrows, and they like to leave these sort of piles of feeding remains, and they're generally sort of roughly 10 centimeters long, and they have these quite distinctive 45-degree angles at each end as well. So that can be another key one. And generally with the surveys, you're just trying to build up a picture. If you get all these signs together, that's going to be a definite classic. Yeah, we've got waterfoals here. You can get these little grazed lawns around the bank top burrow entrances. Again, that's the breeding females. So they'll come out of their burrow with the young in who are fully dependent on them. They'll just come out very quickly, have a little bit of a nibble in a circle around the top of their burrows, and then go back down into the breeding chamber. You can see footprints, but they're very easily confused with rat footprints. So certainly on their own, that wouldn't be a conclusive sign of waterfoals. So in terms of when I was doing my research, what had happened with, I run as, during the introduction, it was said that I run the Yorkshire Watervole project. And so we've done various surveys across Yorkshire looking for watervoles. And we've actually struggled in lots of places to find the positive signs of watervoles doing the sort of classic field sign searches. And yet in some locations, we've even had members of the public send us photos of watervoles, and they're confirmed watervoles, but yet when we've done field sign searches, we haven't managed to find any signs. So this is basically what prompted me to think about this as a potential research area, because there's obviously that question of, well, they're there, but we aren't managing to find the signs. So is there a better way of trying to find the signs and get that evidence that will give us confirmation that their presence in that area? So I came up with comparing 5 different survey methods across 5 different habitat types. So obviously the baseline sort of classic field sign searches, that's what everything was being compared to. Then I had artificial latrine floating rafts. So some of you might or might not have seen these before. They're made out of the sort of insulation foam, so it floats, and it's got sort of plastic boarding on either side or something like that attached to it. Gives you this nice solid floating platform, and that's tethered to the bank. Obviously that means that you can use it if the water level is going to go up and down, it's fine, it will float with that. And the idea is that the watervoles will use these as a sort of a latrine site. So it's an artificial one, but they're quite happy to use sort of novel items in the environment. So they'll come along and they'll sit on these little rafts and eat and deposit droppings and leave feeding remains, and hopefully that will give you confirmation of their presence if they're in the area. I also used baited pipe tubes. So this is just like a section of plastic pipe that was laid in the vegetation at the side of the watercourse or the pond or wherever I was surveying. And I used pieces of carrot as bait in that because waterfowl love things like carrot and apple. So I went with carrot as baiting, and the same thing with the idea that they would go into the tube, investigate the tube, eat the carrot, leave droppings and feeding remains and hopefully signs that they've been there. And this was a method that has been used to survey for water shrew before, but as far as I'm aware, it's never been used for water voles. So I thought I'd just upsize the size of the pipe and try and use it for water voles. I was lucky enough to have use of a conservation detection dog. So this is Rex from K9 Consultancy. And yeah, obviously he's trained to sniff out not the water voles specifically themselves, but their droppings, latrines, and even feeding remains. Obviously, dogs have a great sense of smell compared to us. And so he was able to search the same areas that I was surveying with my field sign searches and try and sniff out the water voles. And then he would indicate if he found something, and then myself and his handler would check and confirm whether or not he'd found something, and if he had, he got his ball as a reward, which he was very pleased with. So that was great. Great to see him working in action. And then the final survey method was the use of aquatic eDNA sampling, so environmental DNA. So again, that was just a broad spectrum, like aquatic mammalian eDNA sample, so not specifically for water voles, but obviously would pick up water voles if they were present in the water at that site, but also gave me lots of other data on other mammals that have been in the water, and also things like water shrew, it picked up stuff like that as well. So that was the aquatic eDNA. So I looked at these 5 different survey methods. I had 7 different sites across Yorkshire, and at some of the sites there was more than one habitat type. So I looked at 5 different habitat types. And I categorised those according to the guidance in the Watervole Conservation Handbook. So I had canal, ditch, marsh and bog, ponds and running water, and those were the 5 different kind of habitat types that I looked at. And so for each of these sites, it was either a 500-metre section of watercourse or the perimeter of the pond, depending on the size of it, or a 500-metre section if it was a larger body of pond water, and then just like a transect within the sort of marsh bog areas. So trying to sort of make those surveys comparable. The rafts and the tubes were left in place for 2 weeks before I went back to check them, and for all of the survey methods, if I found any positive signs of water voles, they were recorded using GPS. So then I had all that data that I collected and took back and used to put that basically all into like an Excel spreadsheet, and then that was put into R for analysis in R. So this just shows one of my bits of results. So this is a bit of a comparison table basically. So it shows here the different habitat types down the side, and then the different survey methods across the top. And so the first column obviously is the sort of baseline, the field sign survey. So a 1 indicates that found a positive results, records of water voles were found by the field sign. So as you can see, across all the habitats apart from the marsh and the bog, the field sign searches found signs of water voles. And then for each of the others, I've compared that. So again, it shows you with the 1s or the 0s whether or not it detected water vole or not, the survey method, across the habitat types. And then the green is where there's agreement with the field sign surveys, and red is where there's a difference. So I used then within our a binomial test was used to compare the observed frequencies of those 2 categories of presence and absence to the frequencies that you'd expect under a binomial distribution with a specified probability parameter. So by default, obviously, with the presence and absence, the probability parameter for both groups is 0.5. It came out with a p-value of 0.0038. So it was obviously, it came out with much lower than the sort of significant level that you'd be looking for. So it shows really that there was just significant agreement. I mean, as you can sort of see just visually from that red and green, significant agreement between the outcomes of the different types of survey methods and the searching for field signs across all of the habitat types. Obviously, there is a bit of an exception there with the running water. That didn't do so well in terms of the tubes being detected. That was for various reasons. So a lot of the times they got washed out if the water levels changed in that running water habitat. It was a really steep sided watercourse, and the dog really did struggle to get access down to that. So I think that's why. And the eDNA, again, there is quite a lot of evidence that in running water, eDNA, obviously there's a high chance of it being washed downstream. So although they were present in that running water environment, the eDNA didn't actually pick those up. So the sort of main sort of outcome of my research results was, I mean, I have to be honest, I was expecting there to be more difference between the different types of survey methods. You know, I guess I was hoping there'd be more difference. Obviously, that's not what the results showed. It's a very small sample size, obviously. You know, you'd need far more research to be able to say for sure that that's the sort of outcome. But obviously, from the results that I've got, there's that significant agreement between those different survey methods. So obviously then you have to go on and consider other factors, obviously, when you're looking at what's the best option in terms of survey. So just a few of the things obviously you need to take into account is like how much training do you require, what the site is like. It's not always accessible to be able to search for field signs, or it can be very difficult. As I found, you know, trying to search a really deep or steep sided watercourse is actually really difficult. It's quite time consuming. What kind of survey equipment do you need? I mean, it was fine. I had all the rafts and all the tubes, but actually then it turns out trying to carry all those to a site, if it's not really close to where you can park, that's actually something that's really important to consider, because they're not very heavy altogether, but they're quite bulky, and you just need to think about some of the practicalities. The same thing with storing and transporting survey equipment. I just had a lot of survey equipment stacked everywhere in my house for a long time. So again, it's just that those sort of practicalities of that. Then there's also the cost element, obviously. You can train volunteers to do field sign searches, and it's relatively easy once you've got the knowledge. But some of the other survey methods, the use of the detection dog was absolutely fantastic. And there was one site where it was only the detection dog and the eDNA that picked up signs of water vole. And to be honest, the detection dog at that site found 2 droppings, and that was it. And it was, so, I mean, that was incredible. But the cost of the detection dog was quite a lot of money for, you know, 3 days of surveying was, you know, £2,000 plus. And not every organisation has got that money to be able to do that. Same thing with the eDNA. The analysis, sending off the samples for analysis is quite expensive, and again, it works out relatively quite costly for the number of samples that you can collect. And obviously, the more samples you can collect, the better likelihood the results are going to be accurate. But again, that just increases the cost. And also, you know, how many survey visits do you need? You know, it was great to be able to put the rafts out, but then I had to go and collect them back, but that was fine. But you can leave them there for lengths of time, and that's fine. So yeah, there's a lot of different factors to consider, I think, when you're trying to decide what's the best option. And sometimes it depends on the site as well. So yeah, just to sort of pull that together then. So as I say, despite what I think when I was initially sort of set out to do the research, my results actually support the continued use of field sign searches, really to detect the presence of water vole. I think where access is suitable, even across a range of different habitat types, I personally still think that's the best option. I think the alternative techniques, as I say, obviously there was that one particular site where the dog picked up the droppings, and the eDNA picked it up, and none of the other methods did. So that's great in certain circumstances. So supplementary survey options are give a different element, and might be able to be possibly used to complement field sign searches. But again, it's gonna come down to, you know, how much time and how much money you've got to be able to put into that. But yeah, especially where field science searchers haven't managed to detect water vole, I think potentially then some of the other options come into their own a bit more. So yeah, just to quickly go over that, just to recap. So I've given you a bit of a background to water voles, an introduction to them for those people who didn't know what they were, a few of the factors that are affecting them and their distribution and status, how I went about comparing my 5 different survey methods and results and analysis that I did, and some of my conclusions very briefly, obviously. And yeah, so then I've just sort of stuck down a few further questions here. I mean, yeah, what are the key limitations of this research and how could they be addressed? I mean, yeah, there's certainly a few for sure. As I say, it's very small amount of survey, you know, it would need to be replicated many times to be able to give a definite conclusion, I think. You know, I mean, what do other people think is the most important factor when choosing a survey method? I'm interested as to whether the density of the water vole population might affect the survey outcomes. It's difficult to know. Obviously, that's the kind of, I don't know how you would work that out. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to know whether at that site where only the dog and the eDNA picked it up, is there just a really small number of water voles living at that site, and is that why? Do they leave less field signs when there's only a low population? Are they not as bothered about sort of marking their territories, and so they don't leave as many signs? I'm not sure. Yeah, and again, that kind of links into that last question there. So do alternative methods increase the likelihood of detecting water voles at low population densities? Maybe, I don't know. So there you go. That was all I was gonna go through for now. So if that's okay, I'll stop sharing my screen. Yeah, if that's okay.
Well, thanks very much, Catherine. That was great. Really interesting.
I think that was slightly longer than 20 minutes, but hey ho.
That's fine. We've got plenty of time for questions all the same. So I'm going to use chairman's privilege and start off with a quick question, which relates to your first question on your last slide, which is about the limitations of the study. I might have missed it, but you had 5 different habitat types. You tried 5 different methods. How many replicate sites did you have within each of those different 5 habitat types?
Some of them were replicated. I certainly had, I'm trying to think now. I feel like it's a few years. That's terrible. I should know, shouldn't I? I should have checked. So for sure, I had 2 sites on the canal. I definitely had at least 2 sites of ditches, and I think I had 2 marsh and bog. I might have had 3 or 4 ponds, and 2 on the running water. So yeah, there were maybe a couple of replicates of each, but not that, like I say, not that many. You know, so it's even with 7 sites and multiple different habitat types at some of those sites, it's still a very, very small sample size. That's why it's with a massive caveat.
So yeah, in answer to your first question, you know, I guess my recommendation for what it's worth would be more replicates within each of those habitat types, and hopefully, you know, someone will repeat the work doing just that, and then we'll have a bigger data set on which to base, you know, any conclusions. But I mean, you started the ball rolling, so you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's it. I'd love to have done more, but obviously I had a limited period of time in which to do, and even just doing all of those surveys took a long time.
Yeah, I bet.
Just as one person. So but yeah, obviously if you had like a massive load of mass of people, that would be great to, or even just to use data that other people have collected. I did really struggle actually to find any sort of other evidence from any other sort of comparative surveys for water voles. There were a few papers briefly mentioning the use of floating rafts, but nothing, very limited. That's kind of why I thought, well, it looked to me like a bit of a gap in the kind of research. So,
and I guess another question would be, what were your criteria for selecting the sites?
So I did use the maps from the National Water Vole Database and Mapping Project. So there are different sort of focal areas of maps and that. So you get what are called alert areas. And so I basically chose sites that fell within the alert areas for the Humber River Basin district, or the Humber mapping that they had. So basically sort of highlighting areas where there are or have potentially in the past been water vole populations, but I didn't know whether there were water voles at the sites before I went.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, lovely. I'm going to hand over to Annie. You had a couple of questions in the chat. Would you like to ask them?
I did. I was getting a bit typo heavy. Sorry. Well, I think the sort of latter one that I asked is about using the sort of, so the platform service I thought was quite interesting. I've been working on a site recently which has proven quite difficult for numerous reasons, namely the habitats that are there. But did you feel that if you had other methods, like these other methods was sort of, more research was done and they were confirmed to be just as effective, then you could reduce the need for those sort of 2 survey visits, or even use potentially sort of 2 methods together to identify those lower populations? 2 questions in one there, but but yeah, I was my mind was sort of just thinking about particularly the sites that are harder to sort of survey, whether they'd be scaled to maybe amend the guidance slightly in that sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because certainly so I'm not sure that I mentioned it, but I did actually repeat the surveys twice. So I did them, as I say, in the first sort of half of the survey season, and again, so I think the first lot was mostly sort of June, July time, early July, and then the second lot were in September. Again, just to try and sort of get a wider data set and also maximize. And there were certain sites where there were very few or no signs in the first surveys, but far more in the second, which kind of makes sense and ties in with the sort of, it's towards the end of the breeding season. So that's kind of when you're going to get your maximum populations. So I suppose when the best practice guidance says that you should have 2 survey, certainly if it's for things like planning and that, you should be having 2 surveys done throughout that survey season. So yeah, whether it's viable to just sort of say, oh well, actually we'll just do 1 at the end of the survey season, I wouldn't want to say that or make that call really, personally, but yeah, I think it's like a lot of things, isn't it? You just go that one time and it's like a snapshot, isn't it? And they are mobile animals, and so I think 2 survey visits is still good. It's definitely an interesting point what you're saying about using 2 different kind of survey methods though, especially, and I have done that as well, and I've done that since, where I've gone and looked for field signs and then also left out rafts as well, with the hope that when I go back, if I can't, that there's some signs left on the rafts. So that just kind of extends the sort of survey period. But if you leave the rafts out there, hopefully that gives them more chance to pick up signs potentially.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think there's probably something in your suggestion that some of these methods might be better at higher density than lower density, and of course that would reinforce the idea of using more than one method at any site where you don't know whether they're present or not. Sorry, Annie, you were about to ask something else.
That's okay. No, I was just going to say on the note of the platforms, did you use baited platforms or not? Do they just use them anyway?
They will just use them. Yeah, I didn't put any bait on the platforms. I mean, you can do, and obviously I know that has been done in certain instances that I'm aware of. But yeah, I didn't bait the platforms in my research, and they did use them. But again, it was, I think they just vary. I don't know. It's very difficult. There was one site in particular where I found a lot of field signs. There were obviously quite a lot of water voles there, and there were hardly any signs left on the floating rafts. But at that location, they were in the tubes. They loved the tubes. But in other places, there were lots on the rafts and there were none in the tubes. I don't know. It's kind of a bit, so obviously it was like an overall, did that survey method find them or not? But when you sort of when I went into the detail, which I didn't obviously I couldn't cover all of that in my dissertation. But when you start looking into the finer detail of whether some of them worked better or not in certain locations, there was quite a lot of variation. But that's just sort of my thoughts of like, well, maybe that site they couldn't be bothered to use the raft. I don't know.
And just
That's really helpful. Thank you.
when you did bait either tubes or rafts, what did you use as the bait? Sorry,
it was carrot that I used in the tubes.
Oh, it was
and
carrot.
That was I mainly decided to bait the tubes just because I thought maybe they would be less likely to use to go into them otherwise. It has sort of been shown that they'll use floating rafts definitely, but because the baited pipe tubes hadn't been used as far as I was aware, I thought that it was a good plan to bait those with carrot. So yeah,
I mean, I guess in some habitats carrot might be more attractive than in others to a water vole based on the availability of alternative food. Certainly that's the case with trying to trap other mammals, things like badgers, for example. There's been a couple of questions in the chat that relate to sort of novel techniques for surveying or monitoring water voles. So the first one is whether you've used drones or heard about drones being used to pick up presumably water vole signs. And the second one is whether tubes have been used with camera traps inside them so that you can identify what's been going in and out of them from the camera images.
I'm not aware of the use. I mean, I know drones are amazing, aren't they? But I'm not aware of drones being used. I mean, I think that would be difficult. Well, I personally think it'd be difficult. I don't know how you would, unless you can see. Obviously, there were occasions where I did see live water voles, and they would swim across the watercourse, but that's few and far between. So I think if you're trying to find, I mean, I was literally parting the vegetation to find the field signs. They're fairly well hidden. I mean, I know drones are pretty impressive, but I don't know whether they're that good yet.
But perhaps for identifying, if it were fitted, for example, I mean, I'm starting to get into Star Wars territory here, but if a drone were fitted with a quite sensitive LiDAR sensor, then it could pick up differences in ground temperature, and maybe an occupied water vole burrow would be a little bit warmer than the surrounding substrate.
I was going to say, unless you got like a heat sensitive one, or one that could pick up, small mammals. But then I suppose how would you? You'd need some fine detail to tell whether it was a waterfall. I suppose. I'm not sure whether maybe they'll be able to do that in the future. That would be cool.
Well,
be certainly
sure
less intrusive than some things, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And how about putting cameras in tubes? I know that's been used for monitoring small mammals.
It definitely has, and that was one of the options I considered. It did basically come down to cost and not being able to have enough cameras deployed at the same time across all the sites, and that's why I didn't use the camera trap thing. But I know that has been done in other studies, certainly up at a site in Scotland where there's been quite a lot of research about water voles, and done, and that was one of the ones they used. They compared, I think, it was comparing eDNA and camera traps and field signs, I think. And so that's certainly, it's definitely an option. But as I say, it just came down to, we have got some camera traps in our team, but not enough.
So there was another question in the chat was what density you deployed the rafts and the pipes at each site, because that could affect the encounter rate.
So I went with the latest guidance, which I think they'd just updated that point. It used to be that it was said that it should be every 20 meters, and then I think they'd increase that up to 50 meters. So I put them every 50 meters along that 500-meter stretch, and the rafts and the tubes were put at the same location as far as possible. Obviously, the rafts were floating on the water, and then the tubes were on the bank side, but in the same location as close as possible.
I guess one possible approach to trying to detect signs in lower areas where you suspect the density is much lower or whatever is to simply deploy your tubes or rafts at a higher density, and also keep them out for longer.
Because the idea being, obviously, I think what they're looking at there in terms of that 50-meter thing is that's normally, if you've got a reasonable density of population, that's the sort of territory size of an average female. So if you've got one every 50 meters, then you're likely to pick up those, or they're likely to use them as latrine sites to mark their territories. That's where that 50-meter came from. So yeah, potentially if there's not so many of them, or yeah, they will have potentially larger ranges, and spread over a wider area. But yeah, obviously trying to increase the density of the platforms and the tubes might increase the chances of picking up signs.
Sure. There's another question in the chat here, which is I might have missed it, but were any of your habitat types in urban settings? Presumably some of these methods are more challenging in urban areas due to vandalism and other things. I believe there's some research suggesting that urban areas could provide refugia from mink predation.
Yeah, so there were certainly several of my sites were in more urban areas. So one of them was on, or two of them were on the River Foss in York, which is obviously, yeah, a quite built up area. I mean, I tried as far as possible, obviously I was hiding the tubes in the vegetation, and the rafts were attached to the bank, but they were publicly accessible. But to be honest, I didn't lose any rafts to vandalism, I have to admit. So that was good. I did lose some to getting washed away, despite my best efforts to like tether them down, or being stranded on the bank. That was another one where the water levels just changed so much, and then they got stranded on the bank side. Obviously, they're supposed to float back down again, but they hadn't in several spots. But yeah, certainly, it was, yeah. They weren't all sort of rural areas. I'm not convinced about the urban areas offering refuge from mink, unfortunately. We certainly have mink on the River Foss, and we are trapping for them because we have water voles still in that area. And yeah, they're quite happy. I've only just recently had reports of a family of mink literally at the Guildhall in the centre of York, which is right in the very centre of York. So yeah, sadly they're not put off by urban areas.
Yeah. Another question here. Do you think tubes were preferred at times because they offer shelter? Could you put them on the rafts and compare against just tubes and just rafts?
Yeah, that would be really interesting, wouldn't it, to have tubes on top of the rafts? Yeah, no, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, possibly. Yeah, not really thought about the shelter thing, but I mean, it's a possibility, isn't it? Yeah, but certainly, yeah, that would be interesting to attach tubes on top of the rafts and see whether that made a difference compared to just rafts or just tubes.
I mean, it's clear that the work that you've done has raised, a bunch of questions. And I mean, are you in any position to be taking any of those forward, or do you have a successor who's going to carry out a similar research project at EA?
Well, yeah, I think, well, probably not in terms of, I mean, I'm still running the water vole project, but that is just now, well, I mean, we don't have very much funding. We've got maybe 20 grand this year, and so that's focused on trying to expand our mink control, and we are still doing some surveys in new areas, so I try and get out when I can, but it's unfortunately very limited by other work pressures. We're now in drought, so now that's my like we're being told we have to prioritize drought work. So yeah, I've got multiple competing pressures, unfortunately. I mean, much as I occasionally think, oh, I could do a PhD, and then I just think I don't know where the money or the time would come from for that. But yeah, I mean, I think there's still definitely further research potential.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there is a PhD in looking more at survey techniques and some of the, the successive mitigation as well. That's exactly the kind of research that I think the ecological consultancy industry really needs doing. So yeah, don't drop the dream of doing a PhD. I'm just looking for anything else in the chat that I've missed. anybody who's listening in at the moment, feel free to burst in with your question yourself. I don't have to read them all out.
There's one from Robin. Robin, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, you mentioned one of the sites, your field survey didn't find water voles, but your eDNA did. And you thought that was unusual. I wondered if that was because the habitat was particularly difficult. Would you suggest that the eDNA was more effective in a difficult to access habitat type, or yeah?
So yeah, that particular site, it picked up the eDNA was positive for one of the ponds on the site that I surveyed, which was actually relatively easy to survey. And I also put out the rafts and the tube, same thing. I didn't get anything with those. And actually the detection dog didn't detect any water vole signs around that pond either. But then the eDNA did pick it up. So yeah, but then maybe it was just passing through, I don't know, because it's an area, like it's a site with the pond relatively close to the watercourse that was surveyed on the site, and the sort of like marsh and bog areas as well. So I mean, maybe it was just a transient water vole going through the pond and not actually leaving any field, just left some eDNA in the water. I don't know, I can't answer that, but yeah, so it wasn't a particularly difficult site. Yeah,
well, it seems to point to having a second visit.
yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, I was only able to take one lot of eDNA samples just because of the cost of the kits and getting the analysis done. So again, and the same with the detection dog. Actually, I was only able to do those surveys once, and that happened at the second survey point, so in the September. Just because of cost, basically. I mean, I was lucky that I was able to get money from my team, or like from a budget that we had, to be even able to do those surveys in the first place. So yeah, obviously they weren't replicated twice. So again, that's a lacking. And the marsh and bog areas, obviously I couldn't do, there wasn't really any water in those, like standing water, enough water that I could sample for eDNA in those areas. So that was one that wasn't compared, and there wasn't enough time for the detection dog to survey those areas either. It was just, they are limited by like animal welfare and the length of time that the dog can work and the amount of days that we could pay for. So yeah, there's a few limitations in my research. So
sure, okay, thanks.
No problem.
So moving on through the chat, I can see another question here about methods to determine relative density of water vole populations. What's your thought on the best techniques for tackling that, Catherine?
Yeah, so there has been some work done quite a long time ago now, a study in the North York Moors that looked at whether you could count the number of latrines and whether that would give you a sort of density of population. And there is a sort of equation for that, but I'm not sure how accurate that is. I think that there's then been some other sort of caveat or further research to that saying actually it's not quite as obvious or as straightforward as that, or that's not as accurate as we thought it was. So yeah, that I did sort of reference that in one of my I didn't include it here, but I did do a comparison between the number of latrines that I found with the different survey methods for that very thing to see whether it would give a sort of indication of the population numbers. But again, they were all very comparative, and there was a lot of sort of outliers in the data, so it just wasn't a very clear-cut picture really. It was kind of a bit skewed in the analysis, so yeah, wasn't conclusive on that front.
I think also you need to be, before you invest a lot of time in trying to work out methods for estimating density, you need to be sure that there's some real value in having that information. And I mean, others on the call will know better than me whether that is the case for water vole mitigation or whatever, if it usefully informs what you're going to do, and whether you've got a low or a high density population might change the way you respond. but I know that in some other species, for example, in badgers, people often obsess over trying to count the number of badgers in a set, and it's really not useful information. The set's either got badgers in or it hasn't, because it won't change what you are going to do.
That's it, isn't it? Yeah, and I think that's the thing, certainly for the focus of, in terms of my waterfall project now, is just to know whether they're present in an area or not, and whether then we need to expand our current mink control network to cover that area, because again, we've got limited funding, so we're trying to prioritize the areas where we've still got populations remaining. So for us, the key thing is whether they're there or not. You know, it would be lovely to know whether there's loads of them or not, but yeah, it's kind of beyond what we're trying to get to at this point. I mean, yeah, that would definitely be useful information, because where we might have very small pockets remaining, it would be useful to know whether they're going to be enough of a population to be able to recolonize other areas if we can get Yorkshire-wide mink eradication in the future, which is what I hope. You know, can we rely on those populations like recolonizing areas? It seems to be happening in East Anglia, following all the work by the Waterlife Recovery Trust. They seem to be recolonizing naturally, and you'd hope that's the case, because personally I think that's preferable to trying to reintroduce water vole, which I know is quite popular in some places. But I mean, again, maybe that's important as well if you've got a very small population, and obviously you're trying to introduce like a wider gene pool if it's appropriate.
Sure. Yeah. Another question. I think we've still got a couple of minutes. If you're if you're still up for it,
yeah.
Lots of questions here, which is really great. So this one is from James C. They say, just out of interest, were the different survey types used on separate surveys periods of deployment, e.g. were tubes and rafts deployed at the same time?
Yes, yeah, they were. Yeah. So I tended to go out, obviously, just to like limit amounts of traveling and time. I would generally go out, I'd do the field sign search, then I'd put out the tubes and rafts, and that was kind of that done for that bit. And then when I did the second surveys, it was the same thing. I went out separately with the dog, but I did all of that other stuff, and then also collected the water samples for the eDNA at the same time. So yeah.
Right, very good. I noticed that also that one member of our audience, Emma, is doing a PhD on water voles.
Fantastic.
No, it's not a PhD.
Oh,
It's
sorry,
a master's.
A master's.
No, I think I just put thesis in there.
Yeah.
No, it's a master's. I'm looking at urbanisation impacts on water voles. I noticed that there was a habitat suitability assessment, but it was just done on grazing marsh dike, so really specific. And I'm adding urban parameters to that, and trying to get some camera trap footage. Well, trying to use cameras to see whether they use culverts as a means of distribution or not, to hopefully inform mitigation. It's just, well, like yourself, you were talking about how difficult it is to go out with all your equipment and take that time and cost. I'm doing this whilst working part-time, so I have 1 or 2 days a week where I can go out, and I'm constantly stressed about the amount of time that there's left of the summer. So I apologise that my question is not specifically directed at your research, but you mentioned that you use the National Water Vole database too. Is that right? To get your kind of presence or your site areas. Are there any other recommendations for looking at presence data, whether it be NBN or GBIF, to kind of help supplement the research? But that's a bit of a selfish question.
Yeah, I did mainly use the National Water Vole Database and Mapping Project maps just as their sort of like to focus the alert areas, and to be honest, also a lot of it was came down to kind of local contacts and local knowledge, and also whether the site was accessible and whether I could get access. So there were some other sites that I was considering, another site where there'd previously been a water vole reintroduction, but it's a national nature reserve, and they wouldn't allow the detection dog, even though it's a detection dog. They just said we can't allow the dog on the site. And I had the same thing with another Yorkshire Wildlife Trust nature reserve where they don't allow dogs, and they basically said we can't even allow you to bring the conservation dog on, because if someone sees a dog on the site, that just contradicts everything that we've said for how many years about people aren't allowed dogs on the site. So some of it also just came down to where was available and where was accessible and where I could get to with the different methods, and who would allow me access for that. So yeah, it's a tricky one. And we'd had already sort of like a baseline data trawl done as part of our Yorkshire Waterfowl project. One of our local record centres sort of contacted loads of different organisations and bodies and tried to get us that sort of latest baseline data, and that was back in 2019. That's kind of what started the project, and then we were trying to sort of update that, so we've got that baseline, so we knew some of the locations where they'd been in the past as well. And some of it was kind of trying to focus on areas where we thought they might still be, partly selfish, just because obviously, again, I mean, I was like you, I was working full time. I had 1 day a week to do my master's technically, but fortunately, because I could sort of tell work that this was also related to the Yorkshire Waterfowl project and part of my work, I was able to spend more time doing the surveys. But yeah, if you're really limited, it's really difficult, isn't it? And I still, I mean, there would, again, you should be doing survey like the field sign searches. I had to, you've got to wait, and the weather's got to be right. If there's been loads of heavy rain in advance, obviously it's going to wash the field signs away. So I was constantly like, I need the weather to be right, and I've literally got this window of opportunity to get my surveys done. Yeah, it was quite time pressured, so it's not easy.
Thank you so much.
That probably wasn't very helpful.
No, it's just, yeah, that was great, and I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
But that sounds really interesting research, actually, especially, I mean, I've heard talk about the whole culvert usage before, so that would be really interesting to see the results of that, definitely. Good luck with it.
Thank you, Kath.
Well, that's great. That's what we like to see. Lots of communication between researchers in similar fields, learning lessons from each other's experience. That's brilliant. Well, look,
yeah, I'm going to start missing it now that I'm not out doing research now.
Yeah, you're definitely looking for that PhD. So, look, Catherine, we're slightly over time. Thanks so much for hanging in there, answering so many questions. It was a great presentation. Obviously, the audience was really engaged. It's been recorded, so it will be available online for anyone who didn't manage to catch up this time. So thanks very much for that. I'm going to close this event now, just to let you know before we go that our next ASIG event will be on Thursday, the 24th of July. And hopefully Annie is going to tell me what the subject will be. Annie, do you know? Oh, it sounds like Annie's involved with something else. Well, I know as much as to say that it's about mycorrhizal relationships with a certain species of plant, but I cannot remember which species of plant it is. But have a look at our newsletter if you receive that, or online, or you may receive a notification to let you know about the upcoming event. So thanks everyone for joining us. Those of us who are part of the ASIG committee, stay on the line, please. We'll have our meeting after this. And to the rest of you, thank you and have a very good night.